Candace Laing is with me, President and Chief Executive of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. I think when we've spoken in the past, look, Candace, this is getting worse. And even though you might wish to put a rather brave face on a deteriorating situation, the fact is now the idea of a 50% on autos, I mean, Mark Carney's right, isn't he? This is war.
Well, I've said that for some time, Richard, and good to see you, by the way. That we've in fact been in economic warfare for some time. So let's talk about where we were up until Friday. The intensity of the negotiations over the past month was in fact intended to stabilize the relationship so that we could find a pathway to broader discussions and ultimately to what we need to have is the formal review of our actual trade agreement, the USMCA. So finding ourselves in the place we are, we didn't want to be here. But from the business community's perspective, as things unraveled on Friday, there was really no way Canada and the business community in Canada, and actually I would say in America as well, would have been happy with a deal
Right.
that challenges our competitiveness, limits our growth, and leaves us with little confidence and certainty.
You see, the issue, for example, just taking one of them, this idea of French content in musical films or French content and the requirement of a dual language, when that becomes an issue, either the United States is just being bloody minded because it must know the significance of the dual language mandate in Canadian culture and society. And that suggests to me that there is no middle ground, that the US is hell-bent, as the Prime Minister says, on break to own.
Yes, and our Prime Minister, in his remarks today, built on what he shared on Saturday. Today, he talked about how the attitude would need to shift as part of that pathway back to the table. And I would say, as things, got to the 11th hour on Friday, this sense of where we thought we would be able to work things out from a mutual perspective, it came down to really an expectation of you'll do what we say for this tariff relief, and that's really not in good
Right.
faith, and that's not how Canada entered the negotiations. So the example from business that I think should be concerning, that was really concerning for me, is an expectation that Canada would put a limit on its free trade agreements with other markets. And so that really does, limit our growth and diversification, and puts I think, a huge
Okay.
concern on any Canadian exporter.
So I realise you've got many members and they'll all have different views, but by and large, do you think that Canadian business, SMEs and large businesses, are behind the Prime Minister when he basically takes this policy of, look, there's no point in talking, we bring the negotiators home because it's not going to work? Does he enjoy the support of corporate Canada?
It's something I've been talking a lot about today, both with our vast members, which span, very small enterprise to the largest of enterprise and multinationals. And there is a solid level of support. We know that about 3/4 of Canadians were very comfortable walking away from a bad deal. And, I would say the business community, and again, the business community in Canada and the United States, because we're in a different place, seeing the value that is at stake with our trade deal. There was an intentional trade agreement made, um, with the intent to integrate our economies and our supply chains. And the policy, the trade policy of the current US
Right.
administration is in a different place regarding that. So that value is at stake. So from the business community's perspective, again, on both sides of the border, there is a lot of support for the trade relationship and a lot of effort to try to protect the value destruction and the threat to that we currently see. And the onset of additional tariffs, we know that just costs consumers on especially on the American side of the border. Where our tension is right now, Richard, because we do believe it will be some time before we get back to the table. So, in fact, our focus right now is solely on actually not the threats of tariffs yet to come in a January, which is worlds away, but managing the impacts of the
Right,
threat that
right.
was made good on come Saturday, which is these 338 tariffs, which are entirely new, uncharted territory that Canada is really heading into now. And I'm sure the world will be watching as we navigate tariffs where they're invoked for one reason. There's zero investigation, and you can apply them to whatever you want. So here we are with a very targeted, seemingly less macroeconomic impact of those tariffs, but they are meant, as our prime minister said, to create angst and hurt and pain and potentially divide Canada. So we're very focused on business supports and keeping a strong Team
Right.
Canada approach.
I'm grateful. Candace, thank you. We'll talk more